In every generation, certain voices rise at the exact moment a nation stands on the edge of collapse. For ancient Israel, that voice was Ezekiel, a man pulled out of ordinary life and thrust into an extraordinary calling. He was appointed as a watchman, not to entertain the crowd or soothe their fears, but to stand on the walls of a crumbling society and announce a truth no one wanted to hear. His mission was clear: warn a rebellious people of the danger rushing toward them, and remind them that despite everything, the path back to hope was still open. Ezekiel's world was filled with uncertainty, political tension, spiritual confusion, and a sense that something had gone terribly wrong. Yet in the middle of exile, far from hope, he received visions unlike anything seen before: a storm of fire, wheels of living light, and a voice that commissioned him to speak when others stayed silent. He carried a message not of condemnation but of rescue, urging his people to turn before destruction became unavoidable. This story is not just ancient history. It is a reminder of how nations fall, how individuals drift, and how truth can still break through when everything seems lost. Ezekiel's journey is both a warning and an invitation, a call to recognize danger, to understand consequence, and to rediscover the possibility of transformation. If you are ready to explore one of the most powerful and mysterious prophetic stories ever recorded, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us bring more historical insights, powerful narratives, and meaningful lessons to life. Let us dive into the world of Ezekiel and uncover what his message still means for us today. The story of Ezekiel does not begin with a prophet standing confidently before a nation. It begins with a fractured people, a once united kingdom split by pride, rivalry, and spiritual drift. After the reigns of David and Solomon, the 12 tribes that had stood together now broke apart into two separate realms: the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. This division was more than political. It marked a slow unraveling of identity, as the people who once shared a covenant began walking different paths, shaped by different kings, different choices, and different levels of faithfulness. Israel, in the north, spiraled first. Its leaders were often driven by ambition rather than conviction, and the nation's spiritual foundation weakened over generations. Eventually, Assyria swept in with overwhelming force, scattering the northern tribes so widely that history would later call them the lost tribes of Israel. Their cities were emptied, their families separated, and their identity seemed to dissolve into the larger empire around them. Yet this loss became a warning echo for the rest of God's people, a reminder of how fragile a nation becomes when its moral center collapses. Judah, in the south, watched these events unfold but did not fully grasp the urgency of the moment. Though Judah retained the temple and the legacy of David's line, it too drifted into cycles of complacency and unfaithfulness. Some kings worked to restore the nation's spiritual clarity, while others plunged it deeper into turmoil, allowing corruption and instability to take root. As Babylon rose in power, the geopolitical landscape shifted, and Judah soon found itself facing the same kind of reckoning Israel had once ignored. The Babylonian armies came not all at once, but in waves, each deportation pulling more leaders, craftsmen, and families away from their homeland and carrying them toward an unfamiliar land by the Euphrates. Among those exiles was Ezekiel, a priest taken far from Jerusalem before he ever had the chance to serve in the temple he had prepared for his entire life. It was in this setting, not in the comfort of Judah but in the heart of Babylonian exile, that Ezekiel received his calling. The backdrop of his visions was not a thriving kingdom, but a people stunned by loss of land, loss of freedom, loss of direction. Yet even in this foreign land, surrounded by the ruins of their choices, a new chapter began. The fall of Israel and the exile of Judah were not the end of the story, but the context that made Ezekiel's mission so vital. His words emerged from the weight of a divided past and the uncertainty of a displaced present. turning history's fractures into the foundation for a transformative message. In the unfamiliar landscape of Babylon, where the memories of Jerusalem felt both close and unbearably distant, Ezekiel's calling took on a form unlike anything the exiles expected. These were a people who had already endured collapse, who had seen kingdoms fall and identities fracture, and yet they still struggled to understand the depth of what had happened to them. Words alone often failed to break through the numbness that exile had carved into their hearts, so Ezekiel's messages became living demonstrations, turning his very life into a canvas on which the consequences of generations were painted in actions impossible to ignore. His prophetic signs were not theatrical gestures, but a language designed for a wounded people, a way to translate spiritual truth into something they could see, measure, and feel. The first sign drew attention not through sound but through stillness. Day after day Ezekiel lay on one side, his body pressed against the ground for months at a time, representing the long years of Israel and Judas wandering beyond the boundaries of their covenant. It was a posture of burden, an embodied timeline that forced the exiles to confront how long their rebellion had stretched across history. Ezekiel's silent endurance spoke more clearly than accusation ever could, reminding the people that the chapter they were living had deep roots. When he completed one side and turned to the other, it signaled not a change in message, but a continuation of the same story, a story of choices that had finally led them to the banks of the Chebar River, instead of the streets of Jerusalem. Then came the rationing of food, an act that carried an unsettling familiarity for those who had lived through the final days of Judas' resistance. Ezekiel measured out each portion with precision, eating only what symbolized the scarcity that had overtaken their homeland before its fall. The people watching him recognized the smallness of each serving, the way it reduced life to its bare minimum, and it reminded them of how hunger creeps into a nation before judgment arrives. In this sign they saw not only what had happened to Jerusalem, but also the fragility of human security when it is disconnected from the foundation meant to sustain it. Ezekiel's next act was even more striking. With steady hands he shaved his head and beard, a gesture that carried deep cultural weight and was often associated with mourning or disgrace. He then divided the hair into portions, burning some, striking some with a sword, and scattering the rest to the wind. Each action reflected a different fate awaiting the people, some destroyed by fire, some overtaken by violence, and some dispersed far beyond the borders they once called home. The symbolism was impossible to misinterpret. It was a portrait of a nation's unraveling, laid out strand by strand before a community that had lived its consequences. Finally, he crafted a miniature model of Jerusalem under siege. What might have looked like a simple clay construction became a profound reminder of what had been lost. As the people watched him surround the small city with siege works, they saw an echo of the events that had shattered their world. The model did not mock their suffering. Instead, it translated the enormity of national tragedy into a scene they could contemplate without turning away. Every piece of the structure, every gesture he made toward it, emphasized that the exile they were living was not random, but the result of a long and painful trajectory. Through these signs, Ezekiel transformed history, judgment, and sorrow into a narrative his audience could grasp. His actions formed a bridge between their fractured past and the message he had been appointed to deliver, grounding his prophetic calling in the reality they all shared. Amid the weight of exile, Ezekiel's visions carried a clarity and intensity that left no room for misunderstanding, for they unveiled realities both horrifying and intimate, stretching from the heart of Jerusalem itself to the depths of the human soul. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the banks of the Chebar, Ezekiel was drawn into a vision of the temple, not as it stood in stone and mortar, but as it throbbed with the lifeblood of a nation's spiritual life, now corrupted from within. The sight that met his eyes was not of empty halls or silent chambers, but of idolatry entrenched at the very center of worship, a vivid display of rebellion disguised as devotion. Images and carved figures adorned spaces meant for the divine presence, and the priests themselves, entrusted with guidance and sanctity, had become actors in this deception, performing rituals that had long lost their connection to God's commands. Ezekiel's heart recoiled, yet the vision pressed forward, demanding acknowledgement of a truth that could not be ignored. Jerusalem's outward grandeur masked an internal rot that had consumed the city from the inside out. Within this sacred space, Ezekiel saw another layer of divine insight. The sealing of the righteous, a gesture of preservation and protection unfolded before him, marking those whose hearts remained aligned with justice and faithfulness, those who had resisted the seductive allure of idols and corruption. Their presence was small, almost unnoticed amid the chaos, yet their significance was immense, for they symbolized hope and continuity, a divine reminder that even in the deepest decay, God's mercy and discernment endure. The contrast between the righteous few and the overwhelming tide of idolatry painted a stark picture, one that communicated not merely judgment, but also the enduring possibility of redemption. The climax of the vision revealed what would shake the foundations of the city: the departure of God's glory from Jerusalem. Ezekiel watched as the radiance that had once filled the temple, that had seemed inseparable from the stones and altars, lifted and withdrew, moving slowly, almost painfully, toward the east. The glorious departure was not a sudden erasure, but a deliberate retreat, a silent testimony to the cumulative consequences of unfaithfulness and rebellion. The city, so long the dwelling place of divine presence, became a symbol of what happens when a people turn away from covenant and truth, and the absence of that glory signaled the inevitability of judgment that would follow, felt both in exile and in the hearts of those who remained behind. As Ezekiel absorbed the vision, he understood that it was not merely a historical report but a living warning, a story of moral and spiritual decay brought to life through divine revelation. Every detail, the idols that polluted the sacred halls, the careful marking of the righteous, the gradual withdrawal of glory formed a continuum that connected the exile's current suffering to the choices made generations before. In the unfolding of these images, the people were confronted with both their failures and the enduring call to return, to realign their hearts with God's will before the consequences became absolute. The vision demanded reflection and recognition, a narrative that intertwined the spiritual, the prophetic, and the historical, reminding all who saw it that judgment was not arbitrary, mercy was not absent, and the path to restoration, though narrow, remained possible for those who turned back. Ezekiel's prophetic journey deepened as he was drawn into allegorical visions that transformed history into living narrative, where every city and every action became a symbol of moral and spiritual reality. Among the most striking of these were the stories of two sisters, Samaria and Jerusalem, presented not merely as cities but as embodiments of a people's heart, each reflecting a long pattern of rebellion and betrayal against the covenant with God. In this vision, God recounted their history in a manner that revealed both intimate knowledge and righteous indignation, portraying their persistent turning away as acts of spiritual adultery, a violation of the sacred trust between Creator and nation. Samaria, once the capital of the northern kingdom, was depicted as a sister whose allure masked corruption. Her streets were alive with commerce and ceremony, yet beneath the surface, idols thrived. The cries of the oppressed went unheard, and loyalty to divine instruction was traded for fleeting pleasures and political expediency. Jerusalem, the southern sister and the supposed seat of holiness, mirrored these faults in a different form, her temples and altars filled with rituals that had lost their spiritual weight, her leaders preoccupied with prestige and power rather than justice and compassion. Ezekiel observed not only their sins, but the patterns that linked them across generations, a tapestry of betrayal woven into the fabric of national life, each act of idolatry or injustice echoing the choice to forsake divine guidance for human convenience or desire. Through this vision, The narrative of the sisters unfolded like a storybook of human frailty and divine patience, blending historical memory with moral allegory. Ezekiel saw God speaking not only in judgment but in longing, recounting each infidelity as one might recount the painful acts of a loved one gone astray, emphasizing the personal and communal consequences of choices that reject righteousness. The imagery was rich and vivid. Samaria adorned in finery yet chained by hidden shame. Jerusalem radiant in outward holiness yet empty in inner devotion. The contrasts amplifying the weight of their betrayal. The prophet perceived the rhythm of mercy and justice. How God's calls for repentance had gone unheeded, and how the refusal to turn back had invited both immediate consequences and long-term exile. Yet, interwoven with judgment was the enduring thread of hope. The reminder that the recognition of fault and the pursuit of repentance could restore the broken relationship, even after generations of sin. Ezekiel's recounting of these allegorical sisters served not merely as a historical reflection, but as a living lesson, linking the past to the present exile, showing how national identity, communal ethics, and spiritual fidelity are inseparable. Each act of infidelity, each compromise of justice or worship, became a narrative thread that illustrated the costs of abandoning the covenant. As he watched the stories unfold, Ezekiel understood that the imagery of adultery was not meant to shame alone but to awaken awareness, to call the people toward reflection and transformation. The histories of Samaria and Jerusalem, when seen through this lens, were warnings and invitations intertwined, revealing the persistent tension between human weakness and divine expectation, and offering a glimpse of restoration for those willing to embrace the path back to fidelity, justice, and spiritual wholeness. In the stories of these sisters, the prophet discerned the universal lesson that betrayal, no matter how deeply entrenched, meets the possibility of redemption through sincere repentance and alignment with the divine will. As Ezekiel's prophetic journey neared its culmination, the weight of personal and national grief intertwined to form a powerful testament to both human frailty and divine purpose. The death of his beloved wife, a loss that cut deeply into the prophet's own heart, was transformed by God into a sign for the nation, a living symbol of the consequences of disobedience and the fragility of life under the shadow of judgment. This intimate sorrow was not born in isolation but mirrored the larger suffering of Judah and Israel, a poignant reminder that personal loss and communal exile often walk hand in hand. Ezekiel's mourning became a vessel through which God's message was made tangible, illustrating that the pain of the righteous, while deeply human, could also serve a sacred purpose, pointing to the inevitability of consequence and the urgency of repentance. Beyond the borders of Israel, Ezekiel turned his gaze to the surrounding nations Ammon, Moab, Edom, and the Philistines, each depicted with unflinching clarity as examples of pride, cruelty, and scorn toward the covenant people. Their arrogance and mockery, once tolerated or overlooked, were revealed as a part of the larger tapestry of judgment, demonstrating that injustice and hubris are never hidden from divine scrutiny. Ezekiel's pronouncements against these nations were not simply predictions of doom but moral narratives, emphasizing the inescapable truth that nations and peoples are accountable for their treatment of others. Through these condemnations, the prophet highlighted the interconnection of human actions and divine order, showing that pride, exploitation, and mockery inevitably draw consequences, shaping history and destiny alike. Yet, woven through these accounts of loss, judgment, and condemnation was a persistent thread of hope and restoration. Ezekiel's visions did not end in despair but in the promise that Israel, though chastised and humbled, could return to God through sincere repentance, obedience, and renewed devotion. The prophet's messages were both warning and invitation, blending the gravity of judgment with the mercy inherent in divine love. By witnessing the fall of the proud, the sorrow of the righteous, and the eventual restoration promised to the faithful, the people were offered a chance to understand their role in the divine narrative and to embrace the path of renewal. As we reflect on Ezekiel's life and the visions he shared, we are reminded that the struggles of the past continue to resonate today, offering lessons about faith, accountability, and the power of repentance. His story challenges us to examine our own lives, to recognize where pride or neglect may have taken root, and to seek paths that align with justice, compassion, and spiritual integrity. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the life and prophecies of Ezekiel. If you found this story meaningful, insightful, or inspiring, please like, subscribe, and share this video so that more people can explore the timeless lessons of faith, warning, and hope contained in his extraordinary narrative.